The morning at Horizon Haven began like any other day. Gentle waves lapping against the pristine white sand. Palm trees swaying in the early breeze. Soft sunlight spilling across wooden-roofed terraces. Amidst this luxurious setting, in a stone-paved courtyard beside the beachfront restaurant, a young man meticulously wiped down each chair leg, straightened every fork to perfect alignment. No one paid him any attention. But if they looked closely, they would notice something unusual about him, a dedication that went beyond the job description. This was Johnny, graduating with a degree in hospitality management and a respectable academic record. Johnny could have chosen to start from a higher position, but instead he chose to begin at the very bottom, as a busboy. To him, mastering the industry meant starting from the smallest details. He arrived earliest, left latest, jotting down every minor mistake to correct them day by day. While others rested, he observed. When no one asked, he still quietly lent a hand, not for recognition, but simply to be better than he was yesterday. No one knew that at night, Johnny taught himself life-saving skills, learning how to rescue drowning victims, perform CPR, and administer artificial respiration. He didn't do it for a reward. He simply believed that if one day someone was in danger, he had to be ready. The night before fate intervened, Johnny stood on the balcony, gazing out at the sea. Everything was as peaceful as ever, but he had no idea that in just a few hours, this tranquil paradise would become the greatest test of his life. And he, the man no one remembered, would be the one to change everything. A pearl-white SUV pulled up to the entrance of Horizon Haven on Saturday morning, just as the sun peeked over the swaying palms. A woman stepped out, her dark brown hair neatly coiled into a tight bun, sharp eyes concealed behind oversized sunglasses. She needed no introduction to be recognized as someone important. This was Helena, the wife of one of Europe's most powerful hotel tycoons. And following behind her was Emma, her only daughter, newly 18. Emma possessed the untouched beauty of youth, porcelain skin, delicate yet radiant features. She dressed simply in a flowing, pale blue silk dress that hugged her slender frame, yet every movement, every step, exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to being catered to. As Helena and Emma entered the lobby, a wave of staff rushed to greet them with polite bows. The senior manager himself came forward to personally welcome them. Everything had been arranged the day before, from the exact blend of lemon-infused water Helena preferred, to the ocean-facing villa set precisely at the sunlit angle Emma had requested. Horizon Haven was well acquainted with the elite, but Helena was an exception. She disliked crowds, shunned ostentation. She wanted an utterly private retreat with her daughter before their family moved permanently to Switzerland. Emma seemed approachable. Unlike many ultra-wealthy heiresses who kept their distance with a cold demeanor, she smiled often, thanking each staff member who assisted them. When Johnny brought drinks to the balcony, Emma turned to him, her voice soft yet clear. "What's your name?" Johnny hesitated slightly before responding politely. "I'm Johnny, a busboy, ma'am." She nodded, saying nothing more. Just a brief smile before turning away. But that smile, Johnny would remember it until nightfall. That afternoon, no one could have predicted that the sea at Horizon Haven, renowned as the safest haven for luxury retreats, would soon become the place where a woman of high society would plunge into such terror that she lost even the instinct to survive. Helena had merely planned to swim a few laps for relaxation, but an unexpected undercurrent had a different plan, sweeping away all her confidence with the tide. At first, no one noticed. The sea was still blue, the sun still shining. Laughter filled the shore. Children played, and staff moved gracefully through the resort's daily rhythm. Even Emma, her mother's closest companion at that moment, sat just a few paces from the water's edge. And yet she too missed the warning signs. Everything remained as it was, until Emma's gaze suddenly froze. She looked up and saw only water. No mother. Then, a single hand broke the surface, fingers clawing desperately at the air, like a frail branch reaching out from a drowning swamp. The first cry that tore from Emma's throat was strangled, shattered against her rib cage before it could fully form. By the second cry, it had become a scream. "Mom!" Emma, clad in a turquoise bikini, her hair tangled by the salty wind, sprinted toward the waves. Her feet skidded against the wet sand, arms flailing as she yelled for help. But the wind snatched her voice, scattering it into the vast open space. Nearby guests turned their heads. Some eyes showed concern, others merely curiosity. Yet no one moved. Even the lifeguards, men specifically trained for these moments, stood back in their watchtower, exchanging hesitant glances. Someone murmured, "There's a rip current. It's dangerous. Wait for the medics to handle it. Jumping in now would be foolish." Meanwhile, Helena was losing precious seconds in the vast ocean. Her arms and legs no longer moved with control. Every desperate thrash only pulled her deeper into the merciless grip of the undercurrent. She gasped for air, but salt water rushed into her throat instead. Panic made her head spin, and in that split second, she realized she could not save herself. Johnny was at the back patio of the restaurant, wiping down tables for the afternoon guests when the scream ripped through the air. He froze. For just a fraction of a second, something inside him snapped into place. He didn't need to see clearly, didn't need to ask what was happening. All it took was one look at Emma, her wide, terror-filled eyes, her trembling hands pointing toward the sea, and her voice cracking as she screamed, "Please, someone save my mother!" He ran, no hesitation, no looking back. He abandoned the tray of drinks he hadn't yet served, the cloth he was still holding. His first steps sank deep into the wet sand, water splashing behind him as if the entire shore was parting to clear his way. His shoes flew off. His white shirt, damp with sweat and sun, clung to his skin, but he felt nothing. No cold, no fear, no second thoughts. There were no signals, no lifeguard whistles, no shouts of, "Someone is drowning," but one man had already acted. Nearly 50 meters from shore, Helena had drifted into the deepest part of the waters, a place even local staff rarely ventured. The cold current wrapped around her throat like invisible hands, pulling tighter. She no longer had the strength to scream. Even breathing felt impossible now. All her energy was spent just trying to keep her head above water. And even that she was failing to do. Johnny dived in. No warm-up, no preparation. His body had been trained for this moment long ago. Through those lonely nights spent taking lifeguard courses, through the countless hours he had pushed himself underwater until exhaustion. He swam with his legs first, stabilizing with his shoulders and core. His eyes remained open beneath the waves. Every stroke was precise, calculated, no wasted movement, no hesitation. Then he saw her, Helena, thrashing like a puppet with tangled strings, arms clawing wildly at the air, her body rocking violently about to go under. The distance between them was closing, but now he could see the full force of the current. Every stroke he took, it dragged him sideways. The ocean floor was uneven, unpredictable. One mistake could mean both of them would be swallowed whole. Johnny dove beneath her. Looping his arm under Helena's armpits, he secured her in the exact rescue position he had trained for. His left arm locked firmly around her shoulders, while his right hand cut through the water like a propeller. The first kick he made felt like he was pushing against the entire weight of the ocean itself. Salt water flooded into his mouth, but he ignored it. He just had to get her back. No stopping, no losing direction, no slowing down. Every meter towards shore was a battle. At one point, Helena nearly slipped from his grasp. At another, a massive wave sent them both surging backward. But he tightened his grip, lowered his body further, adjusted his kicks. The shoreline was getting closer. Through the crashing waves, he saw Emma. She was still screaming, her knees sinking into the sand, clutching at her dress as if trying to physically pull her mother back to safety with sheer will alone. Finally, when the water was only waist deep, Johnny pushed forward one last time, using every ounce of remaining strength to lift Helena out of the sea. He pulled her onto the sand, cradling her head, his eyes locked onto her unmoving chest. He laid her on her side. Sand clung to her damp face. Water dripped from her hair onto her lifeless lips. Her eyes were closed. She wasn't breathing. And in that moment, only one thought pounded in Johnny's head. She's not dead. She can't be dead. She won't die. Everything that would happen next would be written by his hands alone. As soon as Johnny's feet touched the wet sand, his entire body shook. From cold, from exhaustion, from adrenaline. But he didn't care. Helena lay motionless on the beach. Her tangled hair spread across the sand like seaweed washed ashore. Her skin was pale, deathly cold. Johnny took a gasping breath, leaned down, pressing his ear against her chest. No heartbeat, no breath, nothing. A small crowd had gathered, but they stood at a distance. A few security guards rushed forward, one clutching a radio, another holding a first aid kit. But their eyes were filled with uncertainty. They didn't know where to start. One of them rummaged through the bag, searching for a mask. Another pulled out his phone, Googling how to perform CPR. They had been trained, but they had never done this for real. And now in the most critical moment, they hesitated. And so, the life of one woman was now left in the hands of one busboy. Emma collapsed next to her mother. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling as she touched Helena's unmoving shoulder. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mom, please don't leave me." Then she turned to Johnny, her eyes a depth of desperation he had never seen before. Johnny didn't wait for anyone. He gently turned Helena onto her side, allowing the seawater trapped in her lungs to escape. A small stream of salt water trickled from her lips, but she still didn't move. He didn't waste another second. Placing both hands at the center of her chest, he began pressing down, steady, precise. Each compression was a flicker of hope. Emma clutched her mother's hand tightly, bearing her face against her shoulder, whispering through trembling lips, "Please, please." 30 compressions. Johnny leaned down, pinched Helena's nose shut, and breathed 2 deep rescue breaths into her lungs. He pulled back. No response. He repeated the cycle. A few tourists had already pulled out their phones, recording the scene. A resort medic stood nearby, not interfering, just watching. In Johnny's mind, time no longer existed in seconds or minutes. Each compression was a gamble. Each breath was a battle. His back was soaked with sweat. His elbows were coated in sand, but he didn't stop. With every breath he gave, he inhaled the scent of salt water, of fear, of unwavering determination. Emma's voice cracked into a scream. "Mom, please breathe. Please wake up." Johnny pressed down again. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Then, a violent cough. Helena's body jerked slightly. Johnny's hands stilled as he looked up. Her entire frame shuddered before she gushed out a mouthful of seawater. Her eyelids fluttered. A weak breath slipped from her lips. Emma screamed with joy. She threw herself over her mother, her tears falling onto Helena's still pale face. Her voice wavered between sobs. "Mom, you're alive. I was so scared." Johnny leaned back, collapsing onto the sand, his chest heaving, his muscles burned. Every inch of him ached, but in his heart, it was as if a crushing weight had been lifted. A medic finally knelt beside Helena, unzipping a first aid kit, checking her pulse. But all eyes were still on Johnny. No one spoke. It was a quiet kind of respect. A middle-aged man who had been watching since the very beginning stepped forward. His gaze never left Johnny, admiration evident in his eyes. He placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder and asked, "Where did you learn CPR? You did it like a professional." Johnny wiped the sweat from his brow, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "I'm just a busboy here," he admitted, "but I took lifeguard training at a public pool a few years back. I thought one day someone might need it." The crowd fell silent. Some people lowered their heads. Others turned away, as if ashamed that they hadn't stepped forward themselves. Emma turned to look at Johnny. Her gaze was different now. It wasn't just a passing glance, like when he had brought water to her balcony. It was the look of someone who had just witnessed true courage, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because he couldn't stand by and do nothing. Helena was gently lifted onto a stretcher, a blanket draped over her, an oxygen mask placed on her face. Before they carried her away, she reached out and grasped Johnny's hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me another chance to live." Johnny only nodded. He didn't know what to say. All he could feel was relief. Relief that he hadn't hesitated. Relief that he had been prepared. Relief that a life had been saved. because of quiet dedication and unseen effort. That evening at Horizon Haven, everything had changed. Not because there had been an accident, but because one man, who had always been invisible, had stepped forward and done what no one else dared to do. And from that moment on, Johnny was no longer just a busboy. He was a hero, silent but unforgettable. The next morning, Horizon Haven awoke as if nothing had happened. The sky was still a perfect shade of blue, golden sunlight filtering through swaying palm leaves. The scent of fresh breakfast wafted through the air as the restaurant's kitchen came to life. But Johnny hadn't slept. Not because of fear, not because of exhaustion, but because he couldn't erase the image from his mind. The vision of a pale woman lost in the waves, and a girl who had screamed until her voice gave out. He stood in the quiet garden behind the restaurant, a place where few people passed in the morning. He didn't want to walk through the main lobby. He didn't want attention. After yesterday's events, whispers had already begun circulating among the staff. Some admired him, some were merely curious, some were jealous, upset that it wasn't them in the spotlight. But Johnny didn't care about any of that. He had only one concern. Was Helena truly okay? The sound of heels clicking against stone echoed from the main entrance. Johnny looked up. Helena was approaching. She wore a simple beige dress. Her face was still pale, but her sharp, commanding gaze had returned. Her steps were slow, but steady. She had survived. Emma walked beside her. She was dressed in a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, no makeup on her face. She didn't giggle as she had when she first arrived. She didn't glance around in amusement. Instead, her eyes were locked onto Johnny, direct, unwavering. And in that look was something that could not be put into words. Helena stopped a few steps away from Johnny. She took a deep breath before speaking. Her voice no longer carried the arrogance of the day before. Instead, it was calm, measured. Johnny, thank you for not letting me die in the indifference of an entire beach. Johnny lowered his head slightly. He didn't know how to respond. He had never liked grand expressions of gratitude. But Helena didn't let the silence linger. She stepped forward and reached out, her fingers closing around his hand. It was an action that likely had never happened before between a high society guest and a hotel staff member. I don't think I will ever forget the look in Emma's eyes when she saw me on the brink of death, or the look in yours when you pulled me from the water. I always thought I was strong, but I was wrong. It was you, not me, who kept me standing here today. Johnny simply smiled, his gaze drifting past her, toward the empty space beyond. He wasn't sure how to handle this kind of gratitude. It was too big, too heavy, and most of all, he hadn't done it to be thanked. Emma had been silent the entire time, but as her mother stepped back, she took a step forward. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't hug him. She didn't cry. She just said one thing, soft as the ocean breeze. You didn't just save my mother. You saved me too. Johnny looked into her eyes. For a fleeting moment, they understood something about each other, something that would never be put into words. Helena turned to her daughter. It's time to go. Emma nodded, but before she turned away, she took out a small piece of paper, a torn corner of a notebook, and handed it to Johnny. If you ever come to Milan, call me, not for any reason, just because I want to see you again. Not in a moment of panic, but on a peaceful day. Johnny took it. On the paper was a phone number, written in violet ink, and underneath it, a simple message. My hero. Then they left. No escort, no grand farewell. Only Johnny remained, watching as the pearl-white SUV rolled past the resort gates, disappearing into the rows of swaying palm trees, leaving behind a silence that stretched deep into his chest. People at the resort talked. Some said Helena would send a grand gift. Some speculated that Emma would write a heartfelt letter of thanks, but nothing arrived. No flowers, no envelope, not even an email from management. Johnny went back to work, back to wiping tables, back to writing in his notebook, back to walking the grounds on his break. And whenever someone asked, "Why did you jump into the ocean without thinking?" Johnny simply replied, "Because if I hadn't stepped forward that day, maybe I wouldn't be myself anymore." A week later, Johnny was called to the HR office. That morning, the sky was still clear, the waves still gentle. Yet in his chest, something felt heavy. He entered the conference room with the same calm demeanor as always, unaware that waiting for him was Victor, the head of the restaurant service department, a man who had always viewed Johnny as a thorn in his side. Victor sat with one leg crossed over the other, a document folder in his hand. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but every word landed like a nail being driven into wood. Johnny, according to the report from the day you left your workstation, we confirmed that there was an unfinished table, some sand on the linens, and a few utensils out of place. Johnny frowned slightly. Because that day, I had to... Victor raised a hand to cut him off. I know. You saved someone. No one is denying that. But we have procedures here. Leaving your post without notifying anyone is a violation of workplace safety regulations. You understand that, don't you? In the corner of the room, another manager turned their face away. The young receptionist, taking minutes of the meeting, had a faint tremble in her hands. Johnny said nothing. He sat there listening to every word of reprimand, not because he felt guilty, but because he knew arguing would be pointless. Victor placed the report in front of him. The final decision, he stated, pushing the document forward. You will be transferred to the security department. Your base salary will remain, but your service bonuses will be revoked. And for the next 3 months, you are not eligible for any promotions. The room fell silent. No one spoke. Johnny picked up the pen and signed. A firm, unwavering stroke. Then he stood, gave a polite nod, and walked out. No protest, no pleading, just a man quietly accepting reality. News spread quickly. Many staff felt it was unfair. Some were angry for him. Some even whispered about quitting if the resort refused to reconsider. But Johnny stopped them all. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. I didn't save someone to be rewarded. I didn't do it for praise. If they think I don't belong in my old position, then I will do my best in my new one. From that day forward, Johnny wore the gray uniform of a security guard. He stood watch at the resort's side entrance, a spot few guests passed through. There was no air conditioning, no shade. The sun beat down on his back from morning until evening, but he never complained. Each morning, he arrived early to inspect the cameras himself. He kept the security booth spotless. At lunchtime, he gave his meal to the elderly parking attendant. And at night, he wiped the stair railings dry so no guest would slip when it rained. Everyone at the resort had started calling him the demoted hero, but Johnny only smiled. To him, there was no title greater than simply being a decent human being. The days and months that followed seemed uneventful, but what no one knew was that a pair of eyes had been watching him from somewhere far away, and the invisible thread of fate, stretched taut in silence, was about to tremble with an entirely new note. That afternoon, the sky above Horizon Haven was painted with a soft, golden-orange hue. The sunlight filtered through the gaps between leaves, slipped past wooden fences, and spilled like liquid gold onto the stone pathways. Johnny stood at the entrance of the resort, a walkie-talkie in hand, his gaze fixed on the road leading in from the main street. His navy blue security uniform fit snugly over his lean but sturdy frame. The sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal faint sunburns along his forearms. He no longer wiped down tables, no longer folded napkins or arranged silverware. But his new role was no easier. Hours spent standing under the scorching sun, dealing with minor inconveniences, directing cars, assisting with luggage when needed. No praise, no recognition, but Johnny never complained. He remained punctual. He still greeted guests with a polite nod and a quiet smile. He remained as invisible as if his sacrifice had never existed. Since the day he saved a life, the only reward he had received was a disciplinary notice and a demotion. People looked at him with pity at first, then forgot him altogether. One morning, a sleek black SUV slowed to a stop at the entrance of Horizon Haven. The license plate wasn't local. A driver stepped out and opened the door. From inside, a man emerged. His slate gray dress shirt was crisp, an elegant jacket draped over his arm. He didn't need a name tag, didn't need an introduction. His presence alone was enough to make the front desk pause for a beat. He walked in with the steady confidence of someone who had run far more than one hotel. The lobby manager rushed forward to greet him, but before they could speak, the man addressed them first. His voice was calm, gentle, yet completely firm. "I'd like to see someone named Johnny." The front desk fell silent. Some exchanged puzzled glances. Others subtly turned toward the glass doors, toward a lone figure standing at the entrance, clad in a simple security uniform. Johnny had already heard. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed but polite. "Yes, sir. I'm Johnny." The man studied him for a moment, as if comparing the real person before him to an image already formed in his mind. A subtle nod, a faint glint of surprise in his eyes. "You work in this position?" Johnny simply smiled. He didn't explain, because no words could truly capture what had happened, and perhaps none were necessary. The man didn't ask further. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small item, and extended it toward Johnny. "This belongs to you." It was a key, polished, sleek, bearing the logo of an international hotel chain. "The apartment is by the ocean," the man continued, "fully furnished, in your name. I've already handled the paperwork." Johnny hadn't yet processed the words when the man spoke again. His voice this time was lower, slower. "I'm Richard Beaumont. Perhaps you've heard my name. I'm Emma's father." Johnny stiffened slightly, standing a little straighter. Richard held his gaze. It was no longer just the look of a grateful father. It was the look of a man who had lived long enough to see through those who only spoke, but never acted. "You saved my wife. No one asked you to. No one prepared you for it. But you did it anyway. No hesitation. No second thoughts. And that, Johnny, is what I respect the most." Johnny had no words. Phrases like, "I just did what needed to be done," or "It was nothing, sir," felt shallow, meaningless. Instead, he simply bowed his head, a silent gesture of gratitude. But Richard wasn't finished. "I'm not here just to say thank you. I'm here because I believe you're capable of much more." He took a step closer. "My company is launching a new project in Asia. I want you to manage it." For a moment, the entire lobby froze. Nearby staff stopped in their tracks. A receptionist dropped her pen. The other security guard on duty nearly gasped out loud. Johnny remained silent, unsure if this was real. Richard held his gaze. "I know this is a big step. You don't have to answer now. But understand, I'm not offering this as a favor. I've met countless candidates, people with degrees, experience, impressive resumes, but they all lacked one thing: heart. And you, Johnny, you have heart and courage." His words didn't feel like a speech. They felt like a carefully measured truth. Johnny lowered his eyes slightly. His fingers curled around the key, but he hadn't yet tightened his grip. An apartment and an opportunity. At a time when he had almost convinced himself that he would always remain in the shadows. But what moved him wasn't the offer. It was the way Richard looked at him, as if he deserved it. Johnny lifted his gaze, his eyes steady. "Sir, if you believe in me, I will give it my all." Richard nodded. "I believe in you because when everyone else stood still, you were the first to act. And I need people like that. No applause, no grand announcement. But in that moment, Johnny knew a door had truly opened. And this time, it was because he deserved it." The next morning, as Johnny packed up his belongings from the security office, a few colleagues approached him, extending their hands. They didn't say much, but in their eyes, there was respect. Something Johnny had never seen before. On his way out, he stopped in front of the glass panel he had wiped clean every morning. The sunlight reflected off the sea, casting a quiet glow onto the glass, a reflection of his own journey. No farewells were needed. He simply walked forward, carrying the lessons of the past toward a new beginning. Emma wasn't there that day, but at the front desk, Johnny received a small handwritten note. "May you begin this new journey with the same courage as before. I believe this is only the beginning." No signature, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. The world Johnny was about to step into would not be easy, but this time, his kindness and courage were valued. Years later, on the shores of Horizon Haven, the waves still kissed the sand as they always had. Johnny, no longer a busboy, sat beside his wife, Emma. They lounged in the very same spot where her mother once basked in the sun. Johnny gazed out at the sea. No raging currents today, but in his heart, those waters would always be the place that tested not only his strength, but his very essence. A young waiter set a drink on their table. Johnny smiled in thanks. The boy hesitated for a second, not because he recognized Johnny, but because kindness was rare among the wealthy. Emma leaned in with a smirk. "No one recognizes you, huh?" Johnny nodded slightly. "That's a good thing." But just then, a familiar figure appeared. It was Victor. No tailored suit, no name tag, just an aging man holding a tray, looking uneasy. When their eyes met, Victor froze. His voice shook. "I never expected it to be you. I was wrong. Back then, I was jealous. I didn't have the courage to acknowledge what you did." Johnny remained silent for a moment. Then he placed a hand on Victor's shoulder. "If you want to start over, I have no reason to refuse." He handed him a business card. "Contact HR at this place. They're looking for a kitchen supervisor. I think you'd be a good fit." Victor bowed his head, unable to speak. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shade of the palm trees. But this time, walking toward a fresh start. Johnny returned to his seat. Emma took his hand, saying nothing. She understood. It was that quiet grace, that unshaken compassion, that made Johnny extraordinary. A young boy ran past, tripping over his own feet. Johnny caught him before he could fall. "Thank you, mister," the child chirped before dashing off, laughter ringing in the air. Johnny smiled. Because sometimes the greatest moments in life didn't come from grand gestures, but from the right action at the right time, done with a heart full of kindness. Not everyone starts at the finish line. Some are born into wealth, into privilege, and some, like Johnny, begin unnoticed, unimportant, unseen. But when the moment came, when no one was watching, when no one asked, he chose to do what was right. And that choice changed everything. Johnny never acted for recognition. He didn't dive into the ocean to become a hero. He simply saw someone in need, and he stepped forward, while the world hesitated. Then came injustice. He was punished for a few grains of sand on the table, as if saving a life was a mistake. But Johnny never protested, never demanded fairness. He kept working, kept moving forward, and when no one expected it, life quietly opened a door. Emma's father, the man who wasn't there when Johnny jumped into the ocean, sought him out. Not to repay a debt, but to offer a chance. Because some qualities don't need advertisement. Courage, integrity, resilience. They shine on their own. Johnny didn't boast, didn't seek revenge. Even for the man who pushed him down, he offered a helping hand. And the lesson is clear. Kindness doesn't need an audience, but it is never forgotten. You don't have to be special to do something extraordinary. You just have to step forward. At the right moment, in the right way, with the right heart. The world may not cheer for you. You may not be rewarded immediately. But if you still believe in goodness, if you still have the courage to act in silence, then sooner or later, life will return what you deserve. Because kindness, even in darkness, has a light of its own. And people like Johnny, even if they start at the very bottom, become the quiet beacons that light up the world. Be like Johnny, quiet, kind, and always ready to rise when the world still stands still.